Harlan Blackridge smoothed his jacket, smiled at the bank clerk, and slid a sealed envelope across the marble counter. The kind of smile that had buried three men's livelihoods without ever raising his voice. Inside that envelope were documents he had spent 2 years fabricating. Private loan records, forged signatures, a carefully constructed lie designed to strip Silas Granger of every acre his family had bled for. Harlan didn't need a gun. He never did. He used paper, patience, and a banker who owed him a favor. And somewhere on a rattling train heading west, a plain woman from Missouri with a worn suitcase and calloused hands had no idea she was riding straight into the middle of his trap. If you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or told you weren't enough, stay with this story until the very end, because what happens next will remind you that the quietest people sometimes carry the most extraordinary power. Subscribe to our channel right now so you never miss a story like this one. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. The train station in Mill Haven, Montana smelled like coal smoke, animal sweat, and the particular kind of desperation that settled over a frontier town when winter hadn't quite let go, but spring hadn't bothered to show up yet. It was the kind of cold that didn't announce itself. It just found the gaps in your coat and stayed there. Evelyn Rowan had been sitting in the same wooden seat for 11 hours. Her back hurt. Her feet were swollen from the tight leather boots she'd worn because they were her best pair, not her most comfortable. She had a hat that had seen better decades, a coat her aunt had passed down, and a suitcase held together partly by leather straps and partly by stubbornness. She pressed her face close to the window glass and watched the landscape slide past. Flat, enormous, indifferent. Nothing like Missouri. Nothing like anything she'd ever known. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the letter she had already read so many times, the paper had gone soft at the folds. My name is Silas Granger. I run a cattle operation north of Mill Haven. I am looking for a wife who is practical, honest, and willing to work. I am not looking for romance. I am looking for a partner. If that suits you, write back. That was the whole thing. No flowery language, no promises, just the plainest invitation she had ever received. She had written back the same way. My name is Evelyn Rowan. I am 34 years old. I am not beautiful, but I know how to build a home. I can cook, manage accounts, handle difficult people, and I do not quit. If that is what you need, I am willing to come. 3 weeks later, a train ticket arrived in the mail. No note, just the ticket. She told herself on the long ride west that she had no expectations. She told herself she was practical. She told herself that if the man took one look at her and sent her back on the next train east, she would not cry until she was at least 2 counties away. The train lurched to a stop. Evelyn stood up, smoothed her coat with both hands, picked up her suitcase, and walked toward the door. What? The platform was half-frozen mud and weathered wood. A handful of people moved through it, a family with too many bags, a couple of cowboys leaning against a post, a woman selling wrapped bread from a basket. Evelyn stepped down and immediately felt every single person on that platform look at her. She was used to being looked at. She was not used to people looking away quickly, the way they did when they'd seen something that confirmed what they already suspected. She stood there with her suitcase and waited. She had no description of Silas Granger beyond the one she had constructed from his letter. A man who didn't waste words. She looked for someone who matched that, someone who stood still while everyone else moved. She found him near the far end of the platform, leaning against a post with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low. Tall, weather-worn, the kind of face that had spent too many years outdoors and not enough years smiling. He was watching her with the same careful, measuring look she was giving him. She walked toward him. He didn't move to meet her halfway. When she got close enough, she stopped and held out her hand. Evelyn Rowan. He looked at her hand for just a beat too long. Then he shook it. His grip was firm and dry and brief. Silas Granger. I know, she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite amusement, but close. Train ride tolerable? Long, she said honestly, but I've had worse. He looked at her suitcase. That everything? That's everything. He picked it up without asking and turned toward the street. Wagons this way. She followed him. She noticed he didn't offer to help her over the mud patches in the platform, but she also noticed he slowed his pace to match hers without making a thing of it. She filed that away. Men who adjusted without being asked were a different breed than men who adjusted only when praised for it. The wagon ride north took nearly 2 hours, and Silas Granger said approximately 40 words during all of it. He pointed out landmarks, a tree line that marked the edge of his property, a ridge where the spring elk came through, a distant smudge that he identified as the town of Carver Crossing. He didn't ask about her family or her life in Missouri or what had made her answer a stranger's advertisement in a newspaper. She didn't volunteer it. But somewhere in that second hour, with the wind cutting sideways and the sky turning the color of a bruise, she asked him something directly. "The men who work for you, are they loyal?" He glanced at her sideways. "Most of them." "How many?" 11 full-time, 3 seasonal." "Do they eat together?" He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "Meals," she said. "Do they eat together, or does everyone fend for themselves?" He was quiet for a moment. "We had a cook up until about 8 months ago. Since then, it's been whatever they can manage." "That's a problem," she said. He looked at her again, this time with more attention. "Most people wouldn't notice that." "Most people haven't managed a household," she said simply. "Men who eat alone stop feeling like they belong anywhere. Men who don't feel like they belong stop caring what happens to the place they work." Silas didn't answer right away. The wagon rolled on over frozen ruts. Then he said, "You always talk this much?" "No," she said, "but I figured you'd want to know what you were getting." He looked straight ahead at the road and said nothing. But she saw the corner of his mouth move, just barely. The ranch came into view as the light was starting to go. It was larger than she'd imagined. A main house, 2 long bunkhouses, a barn that could have swallowed her entire street in Missouri, fencing that stretched in both directions as far as she could see. It was prosperous. It was clean in the functional sense. And it was absolutely, profoundly cold. Not the temperature. Something else. There were 3 men working near the barn who looked up when the wagon came in. None of them smiled. One of them, a younger man with a beard that was still making up its mind, walked over and took the horses without being asked. "That's Cody," Silas said. "He's been here longest of the younger ones." Cody nodded at Evelyn with the expression of someone who didn't know what to make of her but wasn't going to be rude about it. "Ma'am." "Cody," she said. "Long day?" He blinked, looked at Silas, looked back at her. "Every day's a long day, ma'am." "Then I'll have something hot on the stove within the hour," she said. "Tell the others." Cody stared at her for a moment, then looked at Silas, who gave a small nod as if to say, "You heard the woman." Something in Cody's posture shifted, just slightly, like a string that had been pulled too tight for too long getting a half-turn of slack. The kitchen was functional and grim. There were good pots and not enough of them. There was a pantry with staples, flour, salt, lard, dried beans, a side of smoked pork, and there was the kind of accumulated grease on the stovetop that told her this room had been neglected for months, maybe longer. She didn't say anything about the state of it. She took off her coat, rolled up her sleeves, and started. Silas leaned in the doorway for a moment, watching her move around the kitchen with the competent efficiency of someone who had been feeding people since she was old enough to reach a stove. "You don't have to do this tonight," he said. "You just got off a train." "I know," she said, not stopping. "Hand me that skillet." He hesitated, just long enough that it was notable, then crossed the kitchen and handed it to her. Their hands were close. Neither of them acknowledged that. "What are you making?" he asked. "Salt pork, beans, cornbread, maybe something sweet if there's molasses." "There might be. In the back of the pantry." "I'll find it," she said. "Go tell your men to wash their hands before they come to the table." He didn't move for a second. "I haven't had anyone tell me what to do in this kitchen since—" He stopped. She looked at him directly. "Since your wife?" The silence that followed had edges to it. 7 years, he said finally. "I know," she said quietly. You mentioned it in your letter. He hadn't, actually. The agency had told her. But she'd said it the other way to spare him having to explain it, and he seemed to understand that because he just nodded and walked back out the door. Armas. 11 men sat down to that table that night. They came in from the cold with varying degrees of skepticism written on their faces. Some openly curious, some carefully blank. One older hand named Rufus, who looked at Evelyn like she was a problem that hadn't declared itself yet. She put the food down without ceremony, cornbread still steaming, beans thick with pork, molasses she'd found behind a tin of baking powder that had gone solid. Nobody said grace. Nobody said much of anything. They just started eating. 2 minutes in, Rufus set down his spoon and said to nobody in particular, "Someone finally fixed that stove damper?" "I adjusted it before I started," Evelyn said from the other end of the table, where she was pouring coffee. "It was running too hot on the left side." Rufus looked at her. "You can tell that?" "You can hear it," she said, "if you listen." Rufus picked his spoon back up and didn't say anything else. But when he thought nobody was watching, he nodded to himself. Just a small thing, the kind of nod that meant all right then. Silas watched all of this from his end of the table. He watched her pour coffee into every cup without being asked, and remember, somehow, that the young man named Garrett had mentioned being cold when he came in, and had ended up with the mug closest to the stove. He watched her ask the man with the wrapped hand, whose name she didn't know yet, whether he'd had that looked at, and he watched the man's face go from defensive to surprised when she said, "I have clean linen in my bag. Don't let it go another day." After the meal, when the men had drifted back out into the cold, and it was just the two of them left, Silas sat at the table with his coffee and watched her begin clearing plates. "Rufus doesn't trust easily," he said. "I know," she said. "He didn't say a negative word about that meal." "I know that too." Silas was quiet. Then, "You're going to tell me you noticed." "I notice things," she said simply. "It's not a skill, it's just paying attention." He turned the coffee mug in his hands. "Why'd you really come out here, Evelyn? And don't say practicality. I can smell practicality. That's not all this is." She stopped what she was doing, set a plate down carefully, turned and looked at him. "I spent 15 years in a house where no one noticed anything," she said. "Not what needed fixing, not who was hurting, not what was coming. I got very good at noticing because nobody else was going to." She paused. "When I read your letter, I thought, here's a man who has everything working except the part that holds it together. I can be that part." Silas looked at her for a long time. "That's either the most practical thing I've ever heard," he said slowly, "or something else entirely." "Probably both," she said, and went back to clearing the table. 3 days later, Evelyn found the first sign that something was wrong. She had been going through the household ledgers. Silas had shown her where they were kept, in a wooden box in the study, with the air of a man handing over something mildly painful. And she found a discrepancy that shouldn't have been there. A payment logged to a supplier in Billings for a quantity of feed that matched no delivery she could find recorded anywhere. She pulled the record. Then another. Then a third. The amounts were small enough individually to be overlooked. Together, they mapped something. She didn't say anything to Silas yet. She spent that evening while he was out doing the after-dark check of the herd sitting at the kitchen table with the ledgers spread out and a piece of paper, writing down dates and numbers in her careful schoolteacher handwriting. When Silas came back in, stomping mud off his boots in the doorway, he saw the ledgers on the table and went still. "What are you doing with those?" "Looking at them," she said. "I can see that." He crossed the kitchen slowly, looked over her shoulder at the paper. "What is this?" "I don't know yet," she said, "but these entries don't match what was actually received. Someone's been skimming, or..." She paused. "Or someone's been creating a false paper trail." The silence in the kitchen was different now, not the comfortable silence of shared work, something heavier. "How long?" Silas said. His voice was very quiet. "Based on what I can see, at least 2 years, maybe more." Silas pulled out the chair across from her and sat down hard. He put both hands flat on the table and stared at the numbers like they'd personally wronged him, which they had. "I trusted those records," he said. "I know." I trusted. He stopped. His jaw tightened. Someone in this house, or someone who had access, or someone outside, she said carefully. Someone who had reason to look at your books. Silas looked at her. What are you saying? I'm saying I don't know yet, she said again. But before you accuse anyone inside this fence, you need to think very carefully about who outside it might have something to gain from your operation looking unstable. She held his gaze. Does anyone come to mind? He was quiet for a long, taut moment. Something moved across his face, a recognition he didn't seem to want to have. Harlan Blackridge, he said finally. The name came out like something he'd been holding in his mouth too long. Evelyn didn't react. She just wrote the name down at the bottom of her paper, in the same careful handwriting as the numbers. Tell me about him, she said. And Silas Granger, who hadn't talked to anyone about anything that mattered in 7 years, started talking. Outside, the Montana night pressed down on the ranch like a hand over a mouth. The wind moved through the fencing and rattled the barn door on its hinges. The cattle shifted in the dark. The bunkhouse windows glowed faintly. And 40 miles south, in a house 3 times the size of anything in Millhaven, Harlan Blackridge sat in a leather chair by a fire with a glass of whiskey and a newspaper he wasn't reading. He was thinking about a sealed envelope he had delivered to the Millhaven Territorial Bank 2 days ago, and about how long it would take before Silas Granger got the notice. He was thinking that everything was proceeding exactly as planned. He had no idea that a woman in a plain coat with calloused hands and a very sharp eye had already started pulling at threads. He had no idea at all. Silas talked for almost 2 hours that night. He talked about Harlan Blackridge the way a man talks about a wound that never fully closed. Not with heat, but with a kind of flat, careful recounting that was almost worse than anger. Harlan had come into the territory 12 years ago with money that nobody could quite trace back to a clean source, and a personality that made people feel like they'd been complimented even when they hadn't. He bought land, then more land, then the grazing rights to a stretch of federal territory that put his cattle operation directly adjacent to the Granger northern fence line. He came to me about 4 years back, Silas said, wanted to buy the northern 40, said he'd pay fair market. You refused, Evelyn said. I refused. That land has the only reliable water access on this side of the ridge. Sell that, and I'm dependent on whatever Harlan decides to charge me for water rights the following season. He turned his coffee mug in a slow circle on the table. He smiled when I said no. That's what I remember. He smiled like I'd just told him something useful. Evelyn looked down at the paper where she'd written his name. And after that? Nothing obvious, that's the thing. Feed prices started fluctuating. Not unusually, that happens. One of my seasonal contracts fell through. Again, not impossible. Those things happen. But looking back now, he stopped. Looking back, it starts to feel like weather that was arranged. It was, she said simply. He looked at her. You sound certain. I'm not certain, but I've seen this pattern before. She paused, choosing her words. Not on this scale. Back in Missouri, there was a man who wanted my neighbor's land for a mill. He didn't threaten. He just made things harder, one small thing at a time, until the neighbor started to believe his own bad luck was his own fault. By the time he sold, he was grateful. Her voice didn't carry bitterness, just the flat knowledge of someone who had watched something happen and couldn't stop it. The difference is you're not grateful. You're still here, and that's why you moved to something bigger. Silas was quiet for a moment. The bank notice. Tell me exactly what it said. He got up, went to the study, came back with a folded paper that he set on the table between them. She read it carefully. The language was formal and cold, a demand for accelerated repayment on the existing loan, citing irregularities in the financial documentation submitted at the time of the original loan agreement. Irregularities, she said. I submitted clean books, Silas said. His voice had gone tight. I have kept clean books for 11 years. I believe you, she said, but someone submitted something else, or altered what you sent. She folded the notice and set it down. Who handles your correspondence with the bank? I write the letters myself. They go with the weekly mail rider into Millhaven. And between your study and the mail rider? The question landed in the room and stayed there. Silas's expression didn't change immediately. Then something moved behind his eyes, a thought he didn't want to have, working its way to the surface anyway. The letters sit in the entry hall until Monday morning, he said slowly. Anyone in the house could... He stopped. Don't accuse anyone yet, Evelyn said before he could finish. Not until we know more. Suspicion without proof just breaks things that can't be fixed. He looked at her for a long moment. You're very calm about this. I'm not calm, she said. I just know that calm looks better on me than panic. Something crossed his face. It wasn't quite a smile. It was what happened to a man's face when he encountered something he hadn't expected and didn't have a category for yet. Get some sleep, she said, starting to stack the ledgers. I want to go through the rest of these tomorrow. Evelyn. She looked up. Silas had his hands around his coffee mug and was looking at the table, not at her. I should say, what you did tonight, finding this. He stopped. Nobody else saw it. Nobody else was looking, she said. She carried the ledgers back to the study and didn't say anything else about it. But she stood in that doorway for a moment before she went to bed, looking at the shelves of records going back over a decade, and felt the particular cold weight of understanding something that hadn't fully shown itself yet. Whatever Harlan Blackridge had set in motion, it was bigger than a few falsified entries. She could feel the shape of it the way you feel a stone wall in the dark, by running your hands along it until you find where it ends. It didn't seem to end anywhere she could find. Not yet. Iti. The next 2 weeks settled into a rhythm that nobody on Granger Ranch had experienced in a long time, which meant nobody quite knew what to do with it. Evelyn was up before anyone else. Not performatively. She didn't make noise about it or expect anyone to notice. She simply woke at 5, dressed, built up the kitchen fire, and started the day's first meal before the bunkhouse had come to life. By the time boots were hitting frozen ground outside, there was coffee and there was food, and something about that specific combination, hot coffee and food that didn't require explanation, worked on those 11 men the way nothing in Silas's operational management had managed to work in 8 months. They started coming to the table earlier, then they started staying a little longer. Then one morning, Evelyn came in from the porch with more firewood and found Cody and an older hand named Wallace having an actual conversation. Not a work discussion, an actual conversation about nothing more significant than whether the river would freeze properly this year. And she set the wood down quietly and didn't interrupt it. She told Silas about it that evening. That's the first time I've heard those two talk about anything that wasn't work, he said. I know, she said. Because Wallace thinks Cody is reckless, and Cody thinks Wallace is stuck. But they both drink their coffee too hot, and they both check the weather from the same window every morning. I moved the coffee pot next to that window. Silas stared at her. You did that deliberately. Sometimes people just need to be standing in the same place, she said. They handle the rest themselves. He shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, in something closer to disbelief. It was also during those 2 weeks that Evelyn quietly, carefully attended to the injured hand she'd noticed on her first night. The man's name was Pete, and he was 22 years old, and he had broken 2 fingers in a fence repair gone wrong 3 weeks prior, and had wrapped them himself with a strip of his own shirt because he didn't want to bother anyone. By the time Evelyn got him to sit still long enough to look at it properly, the break had started healing crooked. She didn't lecture him about not asking for help. She just said, "This is going to hurt for a minute," and reset it with the kind of practiced efficiency that made him go white in the face, and then, once the worst was past, look at her with the naked gratitude of someone who has been in pain for a long time, and just now remembered that pain is sometimes fixable. Why didn't you say something? She asked him when it was done. Pete looked at his newly bandaged hand. Didn't want Mr. Granger thinking I couldn't carry my weight. Mr. Granger doesn't need men who refuse to admit they're injured, she said. He needs men who can work. There's a difference. Pete nodded, but she saw something else in his expression, something behind the gratitude. What else? She said. He looked up. Nothing, ma'am. Pete. He was quiet for a moment. He was young enough that keeping secrets required visible effort. It's just, before you came, a couple of the fellows were talking about looking for work elsewhere. Things have felt uncertain for a while. Evelyn absorbed that. Uncertain how? Like maybe the ranch wasn't going to stay the ranch, he said. There's been talk in town. Nothing specific, just talk. The kind that makes you wonder if you should start looking before things fall apart. Who's doing the talking? She asked carefully. Pete shifted. I don't know exactly. It just seems to come from around. You know how it is. You hear things at the feed store, the saloon, the post office. Somebody heard somebody say something. She knew exactly how it was. She also knew that rumors didn't travel on their own. They needed someone to give them legs. She went to Millhaven for the first time on a Wednesday. With a supply list and a wagon, she drove herself because Silas had offered to send Cody with her, and she'd said she'd manage, which had caused Silas to look at her for a moment with an expression that said he wasn't sure whether to be relieved or offended, and had ultimately settled on neither. The town was small and honest about it. A main street with a post office, a general store, a bank that looked newer than everything around it, a saloon, a livery, and a collection of smaller establishments pressed together the way frontier buildings always were, as if they were keeping each other warm. She did her supply shopping first. The man at the general store, a heavy-set, deliberate man named Norbert, who clearly weighed every interaction before committing to it, thawed slightly when she asked whether he had a particular grade of salt pork and listened carefully to his explanation of what he stocked and why. People who actually listened were rarer than they should have been, and Norbert had clearly stopped expecting it. "You're the woman out at the Granger place," he said, not as an accusation. "Evelyn Granger," she said. It was the first time she'd said it with her married name, and it sat in her mouth with an unfamiliar weight. They'd been married by the county clerk 6 days after she arrived, a practical 10-minute event that Silas had approached with the same businesslike focus he gave everything, and that she had approached with a kind of careful respect, not reading more into it than it was. Norbert nodded. "Heard things are running better out there." "Who'd you hear that from?" He seemed slightly surprised by the directness of the question. Various people. Cody was in last week." The boy looked lighter, I suppose is the word. "Good," she said. "I'll take 2 pounds of that salt pork and a pound of the smoked." She was loading the wagon when she heard her name, or rather, her new name, spoken from somewhere to her left, and the tone of it made her still her hands before she turned around. 2 women stood on the boardwalk outside the post office. They were talking to each other, not to her, and they'd said her name in the way women sometimes say a name when they're discussing someone at a distance they believe is safe. She couldn't hear all of it. She caught fragments. Silas must have been desperate, and nothing wrong with her exactly. She's just not what you'd... And then the other woman's voice, lower. "Harlan says it won't matter much longer anyway." That last piece. She turned around slowly, as if she hadn't heard anything, and climbed up to the wagon seat with her supplies. She sat for a moment before she gathered the reins. Harlan says it won't matter much longer anyway. Women gossiped at post offices. That was true. It was also true that gossip usually recycled what it received. If Harlan Blackridge's name was already attached to speculation about the Granger Ranch in the middle of the town post office, it meant he had done nothing to discourage that attachment. It meant he was comfortable with people knowing, in a general, deniable way, that he expected to win. That was either confidence or arrogance. In her experience, they looked identical right up until they didn't. Waltz. She was halfway back to the ranch when the other wagon came up behind her faster than was safe on that road, and she pulled aside to let it pass. And it didn't pass. It pulled alongside instead, and the man holding the reins was broad-shouldered, silver-haired, and wearing a coat that cost more than most men in Millhaven earned in a month. Harlan Blackridge had a face made for being trusted. That was the first thing she noticed. Handsome in the way that aged well. The lines in it looked like character rather than wear. His eyes were a pleasant shade of gray, and they were doing something complicated that his smile wasn't telling. "Mrs. Granger," he said, tipping his hat with exactly the right degree of courtesy. "Harlan Blackridge, I don't believe we've been introduced." "We haven't," she said. She didn't reach for her reins. She held his eyes steadily. "I've been meaning to call on you and Silas," he said. "I feel I've been remiss. I'm an old acquaintance of his, and I'd have liked to welcome you to the territory properly." "That's kind," she said. Her voice gave him nothing. Something shifted in his expression, just slightly, just for a fraction of a second, the way a man's face shifts when he encounters a door that doesn't open the way he expected. "I hope you're finding things comfortable out there," he said. "It can be a hard territory for someone who didn't grow up with it." "I'm managing well enough," she said. "Good." He smiled again. The full version this time, the kind that probably worked on most people. "I hope Silas isn't working you too hard. He has a tendency to push things, people included." The pause before people was very brief and very intentional. "If there's anything you need, anything at all, you won't hesitate to ask. My door is always open to a neighbor." "I appreciate that," she said pleasantly. "Good day, Mr. Blackridge." She gathered her reins and moved the wagon forward before he could extend the conversation. She didn't look back. Her hands were steady on the reins. That surprised her slightly, because her chest wasn't steady at all. Her heart was doing something fast and unwelcome, the way it did when she had confirmed something she'd hoped wasn't true. Harlan Blackridge was not what she'd been expecting. She'd been expecting crude. She'd been expecting obvious. He was neither. He was smooth and warm and precisely calibrated, and he had looked at her on that road the way a man looks at an inconvenience he hasn't yet decided how to categorize. That was more dangerous than anything obvious would have been. Sorry, Silas was at the fence line when she got back, and she waited until they were at the supper table that evening, after the men had eaten and gone, when it was just the two of them with the remnants of a meal and the fire burning lower, before she told him about the road. "He stopped you," Silas said. His voice went flat. "He introduced himself," she said carefully. Very politely. "He doesn't do anything without a reason." "I know." I couldn't tell what the reason was. She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. "He wanted to look at me. That's the most basic part of it. He wanted to see what you'd brought in, whether I was someone he needed to account for." "And what do you think he decided?" She was quiet for a moment. "I think he decided I was probably not a problem," she said, "which means we have some time before he adjusts that." Silas looked at her across the table. In the lower light, his face was harder to read, but she'd been learning the architecture of it. The way a tightened jaw meant anger he was managing, the way stillness around his eyes meant he was actually listening harder than he looked like he was. "I don't want you in his path," Silas said. "That's kind," she said, "but I'm already in his path. The moment I started looking at those ledgers, I was in his path. The question is what we do about it." "We go to the bank," Silas said immediately. "We get a lawyer, Those things take months," she said. "And meanwhile, what? He keeps applying pressure, the loan notice sits there, and the men keep hearing rumors in town that make them wonder whether to stay." She shook her head. "He's built this so that the official channels move slower than he does. That's deliberate. That's the design." Silas pushed back from the table slightly and put one hand over his face for a moment, pressing his fingers against his eyes. It was the most unguarded she had seen him, and she noticed it and didn't comment on it. "Then what do you suggest?" he asked, dropping his hand. She had been turning it over since the road. "We don't fight him in the spaces he's already designed," she said. "We fight him somewhere he hasn't thought to prepare for." "Which is where?" "Here," she said. "This ranch. These people." She leaned forward slightly. "Harlan Blackridge's power comes from isolation. He makes problems appear in the dark, one ranch at a time, so that nobody's connecting the dots. But if we open this place up, bring people in, let them see what's here, what it is, who's here." "You want to invite people onto the ranch," Silas said slowly. "I want to do something larger than that," she said. "But we'll start there." She paused. "Who are the other ranchers in this territory that Harlan hasn't managed to absorb or intimidate yet?" Silas thought about it. Named 6 operations. She made him tell her something about each one. The family, the history, the state of things. She listened to all of it. When he was done, she said, "Invite them to supper." Silas blinked. Supper. A meal, nothing official, just neighbors sharing a table. She met his eyes. Nobody refuses a genuine meal when they're tired and things are hard. And once people sit together and eat together, they start to remember that they're not alone. Silas looked at her for a long time. You think feeding people is going to stop Harlan Blackridge? No, she said. I think feeding people is going to remind them that they have something worth standing up for. She paused. And then we let them decide what to do about it. The fire had burned down to coals. The kitchen had gone darker and quieter around them. Outside, the wind moved through the fencing again, same as always. Silas didn't say yes that night, but he didn't say no either. And sometime around the third day after that conversation, she came into the entry hall and found him at the writing desk with paper and ink, composing something in his careful, spare handwriting. She looked over his shoulder just long enough to see the opening line. You are invited to supper at Granger Ranch on Saturday the 14th. She didn't say anything. She just went back to the kitchen and started thinking about what she would cook. There was one other thing that happened in those 2 weeks that she didn't tell Silas about right away. It happened on a morning when she was crossing the yard toward the barn for eggs, and she found Pete leaning against the outside wall in a way that suggested he'd been waiting for her. Someone was at the north fence last night, he said, quietly. The kind of quietly that meant he'd been deciding whether to say it for some time. She stopped walking. What do you mean, at the fence? I mean, somebody was there. I saw a lamp out past the grazing field, about an hour after midnight. He shifted his weight. Could have been anything, traveler on the road, I don't know. Did you tell Mr. Granger? Not yet. He met her eyes. Thought I'd tell you first. She absorbed that. The fact that he'd come to her first, before Silas, said something she wasn't entirely sure what to do with yet. She was newer here. She had no official standing in the operations of the ranch. And yet Pete, 22 years old with a healing hand and a loyal disposition, had come to her with something that felt important and possibly dangerous. Tell Mr. Granger, she said. Tonight. Don't wait. Yes, ma'am. He pushed off the wall, then stopped. Mrs. Granger. Yes? You know what you're doing, right? He asked it plainly, without any edge to it, just a young man wanting to know whether the person he was starting to trust actually deserved it. With all of this, you have a plan? She looked at him, at his young face and his wrapped hand and his eyes that were trying very hard to look older than they felt. I have the beginning of one, she said honestly. That'll have to do for now. He nodded once, the way someone nods when the answer isn't quite what they hoped for, but is real enough to hold on to. She went and got the eggs. Her mind was already working 3 steps ahead, turning over what a lamp at the north fence at midnight meant, and whether it connected to the falsified records, and whether Harlan Blackridge was the kind of man who personally supervised his own schemes, or the kind who sent others to do the watching. She strongly suspected the latter, which meant there were pieces of this she hadn't found yet. The morning was cold and still. The ranch moved around her with its ordinary sounds. The cattle shifting, the horses in the barn, the distant voices of men starting their work. She stood in the yard for just a moment with the egg basket over her arm and let herself feel the full weight of where she was and what she had walked into. Not out of despair, more like taking the measure of a thing before you start trying to lift it. Then she went back inside and started the fire for breakfast. The 6 ranchers came to supper on a Saturday. Silas had expected maybe 4 of them to show up. In his experience, people in the territory had gotten cautious about gathering, cautious about being seen together, cautious about what association implied when Harlan Blackridge was watching everything with that pleasant, gray-eyed attention. So when all 6 wagons came up the drive inside the same half hour, he stood on the porch and counted them with an expression that was something between relieved and unsettled. The way a man looks when a gamble starts paying out and he suddenly worries he didn't calculate the odds correctly. Evelyn didn't have that problem. She'd been cooking since 4 in the morning. Not because she'd panicked, because she'd planned for 8, and the prudent thing was to be ready for 12. She had 2 pots of beef stew going, a ham she'd started basting the previous afternoon, 4 loaves of bread that had come out of the oven an hour ago and were sitting wrapped in cloth on the counter, a bean dish with smoked pork and molasses, and 3 pies that she was not entirely satisfied with because the bottom crust on the leftmost one had gone slightly thick. But there was nothing to be done about that now. The kitchen had taken on that specific warm, dense smell of real cooking, not just food, but the smell of effort and intention. And when the first of the ranchers came through the door, stamping mud from his boots, he stopped in the entry hall and just stood there for a moment, breathing. His name was Dale Cutler. He ran a mid-sized cattle operation to the east and had the look of a man who had been grinding himself down for so long he'd forgotten it was happening. He was somewhere around 50, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and was now mostly just tired. "That smell," he said, not to anyone in particular. "Supper's in an hour," Evelyn told him from the kitchen doorway. "Can I get you coffee while you wait?" He looked at her with the careful, measuring expression she'd seen on most people the first time they dealt with her. The calculation of whether she was what she appeared to be or something more complicated. "You're Silas's wife," he said. "Evelyn," she said. "Yes." "Dale Cutler." He shook her hand with the serious grip of someone who'd been taught that handshakes meant something. "You do all this yourself?" "The men helped with the tables," she said, which was true. Cody and Wallace had moved furniture that morning without being asked, which was itself a measure of how much things had shifted in 3 weeks. The others arrived in clusters. A couple named Hargreave, who ran sheep on the southern ridge and had clearly argued the whole way over about whether this was a good idea, the husband still tight-faced about it, and the wife already looking around the house with frank curiosity. A younger rancher named Tom Briggs, who came alone because his wife was ill, and who shook Silas's hand with both of his own and said something quietly that Evelyn didn't catch, but that made Silas's jaw go briefly tight. 2 brothers, the aldermans, who were loud and physically large and made the entry hall feel half its actual size. And then, arriving last, a woman named Vera Hutchins, who was 61 years old and had been running her late husband's sheep station alone for 4 years, and who walked into Granger Ranch with the bearing of someone who had stopped asking permission for anything a long time ago. Evelyn liked her immediately. They all sat at a table that had been extended with 2 boards and covered with what Evelyn had, which was not a proper tablecloth but was 2 good sheets hemmed at the edges, and it was fine. The men from the bunkhouse ate separately tonight, which had been Silas's call, and Evelyn had agreed with it. This first gathering needed to be focused, not sprawling. She put the food on the table and sat down herself, which seemed to mildly surprise some of the guests. They'd expected her to serve and step back. She served and sat down. The first 20 minutes were the careful, testing kind of conversation that happened when people who didn't know each other well were sitting together and hadn't yet decided how honest to be. Weather, cattle prices. A road washed out north of Carver Crossing. Safe ground. Then Tom Briggs set down his fork and said, "I got a letter from the bank in Billings last month, demanding early repayment on a loan I've held for 6 years with no problems." The table went quiet. Dale Cutler looked at his plate. "I got one too," he said. "2 weeks ago." Silas went very still. "So did we," said the older alderman brother. He looked across the table at Silas. "I figured it was just us. Bad luck or something we'd done wrong." "It's not bad luck," Evelyn said. Everyone looked at her. She'd said it plainly, without drama, the way you state a fact you've already verified. "The notices are coordinated," she said. "The language in them is nearly identical. I'd be willing to bet if we put them side by side. They cite financial irregularities that don't exist, and they're timed to arrive when the cattle market is down and none of you have the liquidity to respond quickly." She looked around the table. "This isn't the bank having concerns. This is someone using the bank to apply pressure to multiple operations at the same time." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Vera Hutchins, who had been eating steadily and listening carefully without saying a word, set down her coffee cup. "You're talking about Harlan Blackridge," she said. "I'm not naming anyone yet," Evelyn said. "You don't have to," Vera said. "I've watched him move through this territory for a decade. I know what his pressure campaign looks like because he tried it on me 3 years ago." Her voice was level. "I told him if he came near my fence line again, I'd introduce him to the business end of a shovel, and somehow the pressure stopped." "He regrouped," Evelyn said. "He didn't stop." Vera looked at her with sharp eyes. "No, I suppose he didn't." Dale Cutler leaned back in his chair. He had the look of a man processing something unpleasant that he'd suspected for a while and hadn't wanted to confirm. "So what do? We can't fight the bank, and we can't prove anything against Harlan without—" He stopped. "Without something concrete." "We're working on the concrete," Silas said. It was the first thing he'd said since Tom Briggs dropped his news on the table. His voice was controlled, but Evelyn could hear the current under it. "What does that mean?" asked the younger alderman. "It means we're being careful," Evelyn said. "It means we're not going to move until we're sure of what we have, because one wrong step and the evidence disappears, and the people who helped us get it are in danger." She looked around the table again. "What I'm asking all of you tonight is simple. Don't sell. Don't make any decisions about your operations under this pressure. Hold on for a little longer." "How much longer?" Dale asked. "I don't know exactly," she said honestly, "but not months? Weeks?" Tom Briggs exhaled slowly. "My wife's medical bills are stacking up," he said. "I don't have the luxury of—" "I know," Evelyn said, and she said it with enough directness that it stopped him gently rather than cutting him off. That's exactly the kind of pressure he counts on. The real human kind that has nothing to do with his schemes but becomes a tool for them. She paused. "What does your operation need most right now?" Tom blinked. He hadn't expected the conversation to turn practical that quickly. "I'm 2 hands short. One quit in October. One had an accident." "Cody?" Silas said, without looking up from the table. "He can spare 3 days a week." Cody, who was apparently within earshot in the kitchen corridor, appeared in the doorway looking mildly startled. "I can," he said, as if confirming something he'd just decided. Tom Briggs looked from Cody to Silas to Evelyn and had the expression of someone who had come to dinner expecting food and was leaving with something he couldn't quite name yet. Thank you," he said. It came out rough, the way gratitude does when a man isn't used to receiving it. The rest of the evening was something Evelyn had been quietly engineering from the beginning, even if she wouldn't have described it that way. After supper, people didn't leave immediately. That never happened when the food was good, and the warmth was real, and there was nowhere outside that was better than inside. The Hargreaves stopped arguing. The Alderman brothers told a story about a cattle drive that went wrong that made Dale Cutler laugh for the first time in what felt like a long time based on how unpracticed it sounded. Vera Hutchins helped Evelyn clear plates without being asked, and they talked in the kitchen for 20 minutes about things that had nothing to do with Harlan Blackridge, about keeping books, about managing men who thought they knew better, about the specific challenges of being a woman who was competent in a place that kept expecting her to be decorative. "You're going to make enemies here," Vera said at one point, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone delivering a weather forecast. "I know," Evelyn said. "Harlan's wife has friends in this territory. Women who've been here long enough to have opinions about the way things should work." Vera stacked 2 plates efficiently. "They'll decide what to think of you based on very little, and they'll be loud about it." "Let them," Evelyn said. "I'm not here to be liked by the right people. I'm here to help hold this place together." Vera looked at her sideways. "You know that's a harder job than you're making it sound." "Yes," Evelyn said. "I know." After everyone had gone, after the last wagon had rolled down the drive and the sound of horses had faded into the dark, Silas came and stood in the kitchen doorway while Evelyn finished the last of the washing up. He had his arms crossed, and he was looking at her with that specific, quiet attention she'd come to recognize as his version of saying something important he hadn't figured out the words for yet. 6 ranchers, he said. All of them got notices. Yes. He moved on all of us at once. He said it slowly, the scale of it clearly still settling. I thought I was the primary target. You are, she said. Your northern land is what he actually wants. The others are pressure, collateral disruption. If enough ranches in the territory start failing, it changes what this land is worth and who has the power to hold it. She dried her hands. He's not just trying to take your land, Silas. He's trying to reorganize the whole territory in his favor. The kitchen was quiet, except for the fire. We need that evidence, Silas said. I know. She folded the drying cloth over the oven rail. I've been thinking about who inside the bank might be reachable. Someone who knows what's happening and isn't entirely comfortable with it. There's usually someone like that. You can't just walk into a bank and ask. No, she said. But Norbert at the general store knows everyone. He's been in Millhaven for 20 years. He knows who drinks too much, who has debts, who has a conscience they're wrestling with. She paused. I'm going to town again Thursday. Silas unfolded his arms. I'll come with you. No, she said. You'll make it official. I need it to feel like nothing. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him wanting to argue and deciding against it, which was its own kind of progress. Evelyn, he said. Yes. When you said at dinner that you're working on the concrete, were you saying that to reassure them or because it's true? She held his eyes. Both, she said, which is the only reason it worked. He nodded. He started to turn away and then turned back. The pie was good, he said. All three of them. The left one had a thick bottom crust, she said. Nobody noticed. I noticed, she said. Good night, Silas. He went. She stood in the kitchen a little longer, letting the fire work down. Outside, the Montana night was doing its ordinary work. Cold, wide, indifferent. But inside the fence line, something had shifted tonight, something invisible but structural, like a support beam that had been loose for years finally set back in its proper place. It wasn't enough. She knew that. Supper and solidarity didn't stop a man like Harlan Blackridge. They just changed what he was pushing against. She went to bed and lay in the dark thinking about banks and documents, and a man with pleasant gray eyes who had looked at her on a road and decided she wasn't a problem. She needed to stay not a problem just a little longer. Thursday came with low clouds and a wind that meant business. Evelyn drove the wagon into Millhaven alone, the same as before, and went to the general store first, the same as before, because routine was its own kind of camouflage. Norbert was behind the counter with a ledger of his own, inventory from the look of it, and looked up when she came in with the same careful nod he'd developed for her over the past few weeks. Mrs. Granger, what can I do for you? The usual staples, she said, handing him the list. And I was hoping to ask you something, if you have a moment. He took the list and his expression did the thing it did. Weighing, considering. Ask, he said. Is there anyone at the Millhaven Territorial Bank who's been there longer than 5 years and isn't related to the Blackridge family? Norbert's hands stopped moving over the shelf. He turned and looked at her very directly. That's a specific question. I know, she said. He studied her for a moment. Then he went back to pulling items from the shelf, and she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, There's a man named Gerald Poe. He's been the assistant manager since before the bank changed hands. Honest as the day is long, which is probably why he never got promoted further. He set a bag of flour on the counter. He comes in here every Friday morning for the same order of tobacco and hard candy. He has 3 grandchildren and a wife with bad joints, and he doesn't like the direction things have been going, but he's not the kind of man who knows what to do about not liking something. Evelyn absorbed this. Does he eat lunch anywhere particular? Norbert looked at her again. Something moved in his expression. Not quite alarm, but the alertness of a man who is realizing the conversation he's in is more significant than he initially assessed. Ida's down the street. Same table in the back most days. Thank you, Norbert, she said. Mrs. Granger? She looked up. His voice had gone lower, more careful. Harlan Blackridge has a long memory and not much patience for interference. I'm not interfering, she said. I'm shopping. He held her gaze for another beat. Then he went back to the list. I'll add those to your account, he said. Ida's was a narrow room with 6 tables and a woman behind the counter who clearly cooked everything herself and was tired of it in the specific, sustainable way that people get tired of things they're also proud of. Evelyn ordered coffee and a bowl of whatever was hot, sat at a table near the back, and waited. Gerald Poe came in at 12:15. He was a small man, 60s, with the posture of someone who had spent decades trying not to take up too much space. He sat at his usual table, ordered without looking at the menu, and unfolded a newspaper. Evelyn watched him for a minute. Then she picked up her coffee and walked over. He had mild eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the expression of a man who had not been approached by a stranger in quite this way before and wasn't sure whether to be alarmed or merely confused. Mrs. Granger, he said slowly, Silas Granger's wife. Yes, she said. May I sit? He hesitated. Then he folded his newspaper. Briefly, he said. She sat. She didn't waste his time. My husband received a notice of accelerated repayment last month citing financial irregularities in his original loan documentation. The documentation he submitted was accurate. I've been through his records. She kept her voice quiet and her hands still on the table. I believe the notice was generated based on information that was either falsified or substituted after the fact. I believe this was done deliberately by someone with access to loan files. And I believe my husband is not the only one who received such a notice. Gerald Poe had gone very still. His coffee arrived, and he didn't touch it. I'm not asking you to do anything, Evelyn said. I'm not asking you to put yourself at risk. I'm asking you one question, and you don't have to answer it. She met his eyes. Have you seen things in the past 2 years that concerned you? Gerald Poe looked at her for a long time. His jaw moved slightly, like he was working something over in his mouth. He looked down at the table. He looked at his folded newspaper. I need to get back to work, he said. He stood up. He left 2 coins on the table for his coffee without touching it. He put on his hat and walked to the door. Evelyn sat where she was and didn't call after him. She drank her own coffee slowly and stared at the wall. It wasn't a yes. It wasn't a no. It was the behavior of a man who had been carrying something for a long time and had just had someone name it out loud for the first time, and was now trying to figure out whether that was a relief or a danger. She paid for her meal and went back out to the wagon. The wind had picked up. She drove the first mile back to the ranch in the usual silence of open country, running through what she'd seen in his face, what he hadn't said, whether she'd pushed too hard or not hard enough. She was 2 miles from the ranch when she saw the rider coming down the road toward her. Fast. Too fast for a casual errand. It was Cody, and his face when he got close enough to see was the face of someone who had been sent out urgently and had ridden accordingly. He pulled up alongside her wagon. Mrs. Granger, you need to come back right away. What happened? Another letter came, he said. From the bank, but this one... He stopped, visibly collecting himself. This one's addressed to the Territorial Land Office. Silas found a copy in the mail. It says the original deed to the Northern 40 is disputed. Claims there's a prior ownership claim that predates Silas's father's purchase. The road was very quiet around them. Wind moved through the grass. Is there? She said. No, Cody said, with the certainty of someone who has worked land long enough to know its history. There absolutely is not. The Granger family has held that land for 30 years. Everybody knows it. Everybody knowing it and it being legally provable are 2 different things, she said. Cody looked at her. He wanted her to tell him it was going to be fine. She could see that. He was young enough to still expect that from people who seemed to know what they were doing. She gathered her reins. Let's go, she said. She pushed the horses harder than she usually did on that road. Not from panic. From the specific urgency of someone who has just understood that the timeline she'd been working with has changed. Harlan wasn't waiting anymore. He was moving. And somewhere in the Millhaven Territorial Bank, Gerald Poe was sitting at his desk with 2 coins worth of untouched coffee in his recent past and something on his conscience that had just gotten a great deal heavier. Evelyn was counting on that weight. It was the only thing she had that Harlan Blackridge hadn't thought to account for. Silas had the letter on the kitchen table when she got back, and he was standing over it the way a man stands over something he wants to pick up and throw, but knows won't help. She came through the door, set her coat on the hook, and walked directly to the table. She read the letter without touching it, which was a habit she'd developed in the past weeks, handling documents as little as possible, as if they were evidence, which increasingly they were. The language was precise and formal and designed to sound like bureaucratic routine. A prior claim on the Northern 40, filed through a land office in Helena 3 months ago, citing a survey discrepancy from the original 1856 territorial partition. The letter advised that the dispute would be reviewed by the Territorial Land Commissioner and that any improvements made to the parcel in the interim could complicate settlement. 3 months ago, Silas said. Yes. While I was focused on the bank notice. His voice had the flat quality of a man who has just seen how a trap was constructed and is angry at himself for not seeing it sooner. I was looking at the bank, and he was filing this. He was always doing both at the same time, she said. The bank notice was meant to occupy your attention. This was always the move underneath it. She straightened up from the letter. Silas was watching her. What do we do? He said. The gathering, she said. We move it up. He blinked. The gathering, you mean the larger one, the one you mentioned. She had mentioned it only once, in general terms, after the supper with the 6 ranchers, an idea she'd described as something larger than a meal, something that would make visible what Harlan had been trying to keep quiet. She hadn't had a specific plan at the time. She was building one now, in real time, standing over a falsified land dispute letter in her kitchen. If we wait for perfect information, we'll wait too long, she said. The land dispute filing changes the timeline. He's not going to hold off much longer on the bank pressure either. Both are running together now, and they're designed to converge. When they do, you won't have the room to move. She looked at him directly. We need people in this territory to see what's here, not hear about it. See it, stand in it, eat here, talk here, understand that this ranch is not a piece of failing property that's available for acquisition. It is the center of something. Silas was quiet for a moment. How many people are you talking about? Everyone, she said. Every rancher in the territory who hasn't already been absorbed. Every merchant, every tradesman, every person who has a stake in what this territory becomes. Investors, if we can reach them. A land commissioner, if we can get one here without Harlan knowing first. Silas sat down slowly. He rubbed one hand over his jaw. That's not a supper. That's a territorial event. Yes, she said. It is. Evelyn, I don't... He stopped. Started again. I don't know how to do that. I do, she said. She said it without arrogance, just fact, and that matter-of-factness was somehow more convincing than any confidence would have been. He looked at her. This woman he'd married on paper for practical reasons, who had spent 6 weeks systematically understanding his ranch and his people and his enemy better than he'd managed in years, and said nothing for a long moment. 2 weeks, he said finally. Can you do it in 2 weeks? 10 days, she said. 2 weeks gives Harlan time to hear about it and prepare. Silas looked at the letter on the table one more time. Then he stood up. Tell me what you need. What she needed was Cody's energy, Wallace's relationships with the older ranchers, Pete's ability to ride fast without complaining about it, and Vera Hutchins, who she sent a message to the following morning asking for help and who showed up the day after that in a wagon loaded with 3 of her own ranch hands, in a practical, no-discussion manner that Evelyn recognized as the productivity of a woman who didn't waste time on tasks she'd already decided to do. Who are we inviting? Vera said, at the kitchen table, with a piece of paper and a pencil. Everyone, Evelyn said again, including people we're not sure about. Vera looked up. Including people who might tell Harlan. Especially those, Evelyn said. If everyone's invited, nobody's exclusion is meaningful. And if word gets back to Harlan, which it will, I want him to hear that this gathering is happening, not what the purpose of it is. Let him wonder. Vera considered this. He might try to disrupt it. He won't, Evelyn said. Not directly. It would show too much. He operates through intermediaries and paper. Showing up to physically disrupt a community gathering would cost him more than the gathering itself. She paused. He'll send someone to watch. Possibly come himself under the pretense of being a neighbor. I'm counting on it. Vera wrote something on her paper. You want him here. I want him in the room when everything happens, Evelyn said. Yes. Vera set her pencil down and looked at Evelyn with an expression that was something between admiration and concern. You're a particular kind of woman, she said. I've been told, Evelyn said, and went back to her own list. The next 9 days were the hardest physical work of Evelyn's life, and she had not lived an easy life. She organized food for what could be anywhere between 80 and 200 people. She genuinely didn't know how many would come, which meant she had to plan for the upper end and accept waste as the price of readiness. She coordinated with the wives of 3 neighboring ranches who had come forward to help once word spread, women she hadn't met yet who arrived with contributions and various levels of skepticism that dissolved at different rates depending on the person. A woman named Martha Briggs, Tom's wife, came despite being clearly unwell, and Evelyn made her sit down and sorted her into the tasks that didn't require standing, and Martha looked at her with the slightly stunned gratitude of a woman who had been pushing through illness alone for long enough that someone simply noticing felt like a gift. There was also the matter of Gerald Poe. 4 days after her visit to Ida's, a letter arrived at the ranch addressed to Evelyn with no return information. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a list of dates and document reference numbers. No names, no explanation. Just dates going back 18 months and reference numbers that corresponded to, as far as she could tell when she cross-referenced against Silas's own loan records, the specific files that had been accessed and presumably altered. She sat with that paper for a long time. Then she wrote a careful reply, addressed it to Gerald Poe at the bank, with no identifying information on the outside of the envelope, and gave it to Pete to mail from Carver Crossing, not Millhaven. In the reply, she thanked him for nothing specifically. She told him that whatever he had or hadn't done, whatever he had or hadn't seen, the truth had a way of surviving people who tried to bury it, and that when it surfaced, the people who had done nothing to help bury it would be remembered differently from those who had. She did not ask him for more. She just let the words sit there and do their work. She didn't know if it would be enough. She went back to cooking. The gathering happened on a Saturday in early March, when the weather was cold but not brutal, and the road from town was passable. Silas had sent riders to every operation in the territory with handwritten invitations that said simply, "A community gathering at Granger Ranch, food, conversation, neighbors. All welcome. No agenda, no stated purpose," which meant nobody could prepare a defense against it. They started arriving mid-morning. The first wagons were the cautious ones, people who came early to see what kind of thing this was before committing their full presence to it. By noon, the yard had more people in it than Evelyn had seen in one place since Missouri, and by early afternoon it had crossed the number she'd planned for, and she had to send Cody to the cold storage for the additional smoked ham she'd put aside exactly for this possibility. Silas moved through his people with the careful, watchful manner of a man who is holding something together through the force of showing up. He wasn't naturally gregarious. She'd known that from the first hour. But he was honest, and people sensed that, and it counted for more in a gathering like this than polish would have. She watched him from the kitchen doorway at one point, talking to Dale Cutler and one of the Alderman brothers, and a man she didn't recognize who turned out to be a territorial land surveyor named Patterson, who had come from 60 miles away because, as he told Silas directly, he'd heard things that troubled him professionally and wanted to see the situation on the ground. That was when she knew the information she'd sent out through careful, quiet channels over the past weeks had reached further than she'd tracked. She went back to the food. Harlan Blackridge arrived at 2 in the afternoon. She saw him from the kitchen window. The expensive coat, the silver hair, the wagon that was nicer than anything else in the yard. He came with 2 men she didn't recognize and the same pleasant, calibrated expression he'd worn on the road the day they'd met. He shook hands with people near the entrance. He smiled. He was performing neighborliness with the skill of someone who had practiced it until it looked natural. She dried her hands and walked outside. "Mr. Blackridge," she said, crossing the yard toward him. "I'm glad you came." He turned at the sound of her voice. Something moved in his expression. The recalibration she'd seen before. The rapid reassessment of whether she was what he'd filed her as. "Mrs. Granger, what a fine thing you've put together here." "The community did it," she said. "I just opened the door." She held out her hand. He shook it. His grip was warm and firm and told her nothing. "Can I get you something to eat?" "I'd like that very much," he said. She led him toward the table set up outside where the food was laid out, and she did it with the deliberate intention of having him visible, in the middle of the yard surrounded by his neighbors, eating food from Granger Ranch, for as long as possible. He was smart enough to understand something was happening, and not smart enough yet to understand exactly what. She left him with a plate and a cup of coffee, and went to find Vera Hutchins. She found Vera near the barn talking to the land surveyor Patterson, and when Evelyn arrived, Vera looked at her with raised eyebrows. "He came," Vera said quietly. "He came," Evelyn confirmed. Bold, Patterson said. He thinks he's already won, Evelyn said. Men who think they've already won make different calculations than men who are still fighting. She looked at Patterson. I have something I'd like you to look at. Later, when there's a quiet moment. A document question, professionally speaking. Patterson studied her. He was a careful man. She'd assessed that from across the yard before she'd spoken to him. The kind of careful that came from years of precision work, of measuring things exactly. What kind of document? A land survey from 1856, she said, and a recent filing that references it. He was quiet for a moment. Where did you get the filing? It came to us, she said. We're the ones whose land it concerns. Patterson set his coffee down on the fence post next to him and looked across the yard. I've seen 2 surveys in the past year that had anomalies I couldn't explain, he said slowly. Small things. Numbers that were close but not right. The kind of thing that might slip past someone who wasn't looking for it. Did you report it? I noted it in my own records. He looked at her. At the time, I didn't have context for what I was seeing. You might have context now, she said. He picked his coffee back up. I might, he said. She let him think about that and went to find Silas. She found him near the north fence with Tom Briggs and 2 men she'd been hoping to see. Merchants from Carver Crossing who controlled the primary supply contracts for 4 of the territory's largest operations, including, she knew, Harlan Blackridge's. They had come because Silas had written to them directly, at Evelyn's suggestion, noting that the instability being manufactured in the territory was bad for supply chains, bad for commerce, and bad for the credibility of Carver Crossing as a commercial center. That had been her letter, essentially, though Silas's name was on it. They're interested, Silas said when she pulled him briefly aside. His voice had changed over the past hour. There was something more solid in it, the specific quality of a man who has been standing on uncertain ground and has just felt it firm up slightly under his feet. Good, she said. Keep them talking. Don't mention Harlan by name yet. When do we? Not yet, she said. Let him eat. Let him walk around and smile and feel comfortable. I'm waiting for something. Silas looked at her. He'd learned in the weeks since she'd arrived not to ask for more specifics than she was ready to give, because she was never withholding without reason. He nodded and went back to the merchants. What Evelyn was waiting for arrived at 3:30, and it didn't come from the direction she'd expected. She was in the kitchen refilling the breadbasket when she heard a voice she didn't recognize in the corridor. A young woman's voice, low and urgent, talking to someone who turned out to be Cody. Evelyn came out of the kitchen and the young woman stopped talking. She was perhaps 22, dark-haired, well-dressed in the way that the daughter of a wealthy man is well-dressed. Not ostentatiously, but expensively in the details. Her face was striking and currently doing something complicated, the expression of someone who has made a decision and is now standing on the other side of it before they were quite ready. Mrs. Granger, Cody said carefully, this is Claire Blackridge, the young woman said. She said it with her chin up, the particular defensive posture of someone bracing for a reaction. Harlan Blackridge is my father. The corridor was very quiet. Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. Come into the kitchen, she said. Claire Blackridge followed her into the kitchen and stood just inside the door with her hands clasped in front of her, holding a leather satchel against her side. She looked at the kitchen, the stacked dishes, the evidence of mass cooking, the ordinary productive mess of it. And then she looked at Evelyn. I've been trying to decide whether to come here for 2 weeks, she said. I know, Evelyn said. Sit down. Claire sat. She set the satchel on the table. She didn't open it yet. My father doesn't know I'm here, she said. He thinks I went into town with our housekeeper. I have about an hour before someone notices. She paused. The composure she'd worn coming in was starting to show its seams. I need you to know that I didn't know the full extent of it. I knew things weren't right. I've known for about a year that things weren't right. But I told myself, she stopped, started again. I told myself there were explanations. And then, Evelyn said. And then 3 weeks ago I found the correspondence files, Claire said, in his study. He'd gone to Helena and left a letter half-drafted on his desk, and I read it before I understood what I was reading, and then I understood, and then I went through the files. Her hands were tight in her lap. He has everything documented, Mrs. Granger. His own copies of everything. The altered bank submissions, the land claim filing, the correspondence with the bank official he's been paying. He kept records because he always expected to need them for leverage against the people he was using. A thin, sharp sound escaped her that might have been a laugh if the situation had been different. He keeps records on everyone. He's kept them on me. The kitchen was very still. "What's in the satchel?" Evelyn said quietly. Claire looked at the satchel, then she unclasped it and laid it open on the table. Inside were papers, not originals, copies, careful copies in a young woman's handwriting, but copies of documents that had correspondence dates, names, amounts, and the initials HB at the bottom of 3 internal memos that described the operation against the Granger Ranch, and 4 others in language that was, even in summary form, devastating. Evelyn looked at the papers without touching them for a long moment. "Why did you come here?" she said. "Specifically here, today." "Because today everyone is here," Claire said. "Because I thought if I brought this to you quietly, just the 2 of you, it might disappear. Evidence disappears when powerful men want it to." She met Evelyn's eyes. "But if it's here, in this room, on a day when there are merchants and surveyors and ranchers and someone from the Land Commission—" She stopped. "It becomes harder to make disappear." Evelyn looked at her for a long time. This young woman with her carefully copied documents and her shaking hands, and her father currently standing in the yard eating food from the ranch he had spent 2 years trying to steal. "That was very clear thinking," Evelyn said. Claire looked down at the table. "I've had 2 weeks to do it," she said. "Is there anyone in that yard who can confirm these are accurate copies of what you found?" "Patterson," Claire said. "The land surveyor. He was called in to verify the original 1856 survey discrepancy for my father's filing. He knows what the original says. He'll recognize these." Evelyn was quiet for just a moment. Then she stood up. "Stay here," she said. "Don't let anyone in but me." She went to find Patterson, and she found him still near the barn fence where she'd left him, and she spoke to him quietly for 2 minutes. She watched his face change as she described what was in the kitchen, the careful professional manner going tight and then tighter, and then resolving into something clear and decided. "Show me," he said. She brought him through the back of the house, away from the yard and from Harlan. She led him into the kitchen and watched him look at Claire Blackridge with recognition. He'd clearly seen her before, somewhere in the professional interactions between his office and her father's operation. And then look at the papers. He read for 4 minutes without speaking. When he looked up, his expression was the expression of a man who has been privately troubled for a year and has just found out that his private trouble had a factual basis. "These reference numbers," he said to Claire, "these are internal bank file identifiers." "Yes," she said. "The ones I've been looking at," he said. Not to Claire, to himself mostly. Evelyn thought of Gerald Poe sitting alone in Ida's restaurant with his coffee going cold, the weight of an unnamed thing sitting on his chest. "There's a bank employee named Gerald Poe," she said to Patterson. "He knows where the originals are. He hasn't acted on what he knows yet." She paused. "He will, if he understands he's not alone." Patterson set down the papers. He looked at Evelyn with the focused, measuring attention of someone recalibrating what he'd thought he was dealing with. "How long have you been building this?" he said. "Since the 2nd week I arrived," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You planned this gathering for this purpose." "I planned this gathering for many purposes," she said honestly. "People seeing the ranch and what it is, ranchers understanding they weren't alone, merchants understanding what instability in this territory costs them." She glanced at the papers on the table. "This part I hoped for. I didn't plan for it. You can't plan for another person's conscience." Patterson looked at Claire. Claire looked at her hands. "What happens next?" Patterson asked. "You go back out to the yard," Evelyn said. "You find the Land Commission representative, but his name is Deaver. He arrived about an hour ago, the man in the gray coat near the east fence. You tell him you have something that requires official attention. I'll handle the rest of the timing." Patterson picked up his hat. He looked at the papers one more time. This is significant, Mrs. Granger. I know, she said. After he left, the kitchen was quiet. Claire was still sitting at the table. She looked exhausted in the specific way that comes after a long moral effort. The way someone looks when they've been carrying something heavy and have just set it down and aren't sure yet whether they feel lighter or just empty. What happens to my father? She said. Evelyn thought about how to answer that honestly without being cruel about it. I don't know exactly, she said. That depends on the officials, on the evidence, on things I can't control. She sat down across from Claire. But he won't take this land. And he won't take the others. That much I'm certain of. Claire nodded slowly. He's going to know I did this. Yes, Evelyn said. He will. We don't... Claire stopped, started over. We've never been close, my father and I. My mother died when I was 8. He's been... She pressed her lips together. I spent a long time trying to find something in him worth admiring. I thought the ambition was it, the drive. I told myself that men like him built things. She looked at her hands. He doesn't build things. He just takes them. Evelyn didn't say anything immediately. She let that sit where Claire had put it. You built something today, Evelyn said finally. Whatever you think of what it costs you, what you did today took courage. Real courage, not the easy kind. Claire looked up at her. Her eyes were dry, but only just. You're being kind, she said. I'm being accurate, Evelyn said. There's a difference. Outside in the yard, the gathering went on, the sound of voices and movement filtering through the kitchen walls, the ordinary noise of a community that had come together and found it didn't want to leave yet. Somewhere out there, Harlan Blackridge was still smiling and shaking hands and performing the role of a respected neighbor, not yet knowing that the ground had shifted underneath everything he'd built. Evelyn stood up. Stay in here a little longer, she said to Claire. When I come back, I'll need you to speak to Deaver directly. Can you do that? Claire straightened in her chair. It was a small movement, but definite. Yes, she said. Evelyn went back out into the yard, into the noise and the cold air and the ordinary human chaos of too many people in one place. She moved through it looking for Silas and found him near the main table, and when he saw her face, he separated himself from the conversation he was in and came toward her. Something happened, he said. It wasn't a question. Several things, she said. Come with me. She didn't tell him everything at once. She walked him toward the east fence where Deaver was, and she told him the shape of it in pieces as they moved. Claire, the documents, Patterson, Gerald Poe, and what he knew and what he could access. She watched his face take it in, watched him stop walking for half a second when she mentioned Claire's name, watched him restart. Harlan's daughter, he said. Yes. She came here and did this. Yes. Silas was quiet for 20 steps. Is she all right? It was not the question Evelyn had expected, and the fact that it was the first thing he asked told her something she tucked away. She's shaken, Evelyn said. But she's steady, Silas nodded. He straightened his shoulders. All right, he said. Let's go talk to Deaver. Behind them, across the yard, Harlan Blackridge finished his coffee and looked around at the gathering with pleasant gray eyes, comfortable in the certainty that whatever this woman had organized, it couldn't matter much. He had no idea that it was already over. He just didn't know it yet. Deaver was a compact, deliberate man who had spent 20 years in territorial land administration and had developed the particular stillness of someone who processed information carefully before reacting to any of it. He listened to Patterson without interrupting. He looked at the copied documents Claire had brought without touching them for the first 30 seconds. Then he put on his glasses and read each page twice. Silas stood in the corner of the room with his arms crossed and said nothing, which was the right call. Evelyn stood near the kitchen doorway and also said nothing, which was harder. When Deaver finished, he took off his glasses and looked at Claire directly. You copied these yourself? Yes, Claire said, from my father's private correspondence files 3 weeks ago. And the originals are still in his possession. As far as I know, he doesn't know I've seen them. Deaver put his glasses back in his coat pocket. He looked at Patterson. The survey discrepancy in the 1856 filing. You've examined the original. I have, Patterson said. The numbers in this document don't match the original survey. The discrepancy is small, but it's consistent with an intentional alteration, not a clerical error. Clerical errors are random. This one goes in a specific direction. Deaver was quiet for a moment. He looked at Evelyn. Mrs. Granger, you orchestrated this gathering. I invited neighbors to share a meal, she said carefully. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. And Mr. Poe at the Territorial Bank, you've been in contact with him. She paused. I had a conversation with him. He sent a letter to the Land Commission office in Helena 4 days ago, Deaver said. I received it the morning I left to come here. It contained a list of file reference numbers and a description of what he believed had been done to them. He looked at the papers on the table. The reference numbers match what's in these documents. The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn hadn't known about Gerald Poe's letter. She had hoped. She had sent her careful, quiet reply and left it in his hands and not allowed herself to count on it. The fact that he had done it, that the weight had finally become more than he could keep carrying alone, felt like something she didn't have a clean word for. What happens now? Silas said from the corner. His voice was level, but she could hear what was underneath it. Now it becomes official, Deaver said. I'll need these copies as documentation. I'll need statements from both Mr. Patterson and Mr. Poe. The matter of the altered bank submissions falls under territorial fraud statutes, which means it goes to the federal marshal's office. He looked at Claire. Miss Blackridge, I'll need a sworn statement from you about how and where you obtained these documents. Claire nodded. She had gone pale somewhere in the last few minutes, but her posture hadn't changed. I understand, she said. This will take time, Deaver said. He said it looking at Silas, and the look was the kind that contained more than the words. The legal process doesn't move quickly. There will be a period of uncertainty while the investigation proceeds. How long? Silas asked. Months, potentially. The bank submissions are federal jurisdiction. The land claim we can address more quickly. A fraudulent survey filing can be invalidated once the discrepancy is formally documented. I can begin that process from here. He paused. Your northern land is not going anywhere, Mr. Granger. I can tell you that with reasonable confidence. Silas exhaled. It was a small sound, but Evelyn heard everything in it. 7 years of holding this place together. The last 6 weeks of watching his life be systematically targeted, and now this one small, solid thing to stand on. And the bank loan? Evelyn said. The accelerated repayment notice was issued based on documentation we now have reason to believe was fraudulent, Deaver said. That gives you grounds to contest it formally. And given what Mr. Poe has sent to Helena, I expect the bank's management and billings will be very motivated to renegotiate rather than have their institution's role in this scrutinized in a federal proceeding. He picked up his hat from the table. In plain terms, they'll want to make this quieter, not louder. Evelyn nodded once. That was what she'd been counting on. Institutions protecting themselves was a more reliable force than institutions doing the right thing, but the outcome was sometimes the same. There's one more thing, she said. Harlan Blackridge is in the yard right now. Deaver looked at her. I know, he said. I saw him when I arrived. What do you want to do about that? Deaver was quiet for a moment. He was the kind of man who thought about the answer before he said it, which she respected. Nothing today, he said. Today I'm a land commissioner attending a community gathering. Nothing more. If I approach him now, without the investigation formally opened, without the federal marshal involved, he has time to move assets, destroy originals, prepare a legal response. He met her eyes. The best thing for the case is to let him leave today thinking nothing has changed. It was the right answer. She'd thought it herself and wanted to hear him say it to confirm she wasn't rationalizing. All right, she said. Deaver left the kitchen through the back of the house. Patterson followed him. Claire stayed at the table, not moving, staring at the space where the documents had been. Deaver had taken them, carefully folded, into an inside coat pocket. Are you all right? Evelyn asked her. Claire considered the question with more seriousness than people usually did. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I think I will be. I think I did the right thing. I just don't know what the right thing costs yet. That's usually how it works, Evelyn said. Silas crossed the kitchen and stood near the table. He looked at Claire Blackridge, this young woman who had walked into his house carrying evidence against her own father, with an expression that was careful and not unkind. "You can stay here tonight if you need to," he said. "If going home is—" "I have to go home," Claire said. "If I don't come back tonight, he'll know something happened, and you need him not to know." She stood up, smoothing the front of her coat with both hands. She looked at Silas, then at Evelyn. "I want you to know that I'm not doing this against him because I hate him. I want to be clear about that." "I know," Evelyn said. "He's not a good man," Claire said quietly. "But he's the only family I have, and that's a complicated thing to live with." Neither Evelyn nor Silas said anything to that, because there wasn't anything useful to say. Some truths were just true and didn't need decoration. Claire picked up her empty satchel and walked to the door. She stopped without turning around. "Mrs. Granger, that meal you put out today." "Yes?" "It was the best food I've eaten in a long time," she said. "I thought you should know that." She left. Evelyn stood in the kitchen doorway and listened to her footsteps cross the corridor and go out the back way. Then she turned around and looked at Silas. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Or rather, she had seen the components of it separately, but not all assembled at the same time. The relief was there, and the exhaustion of someone who has been tense for a very long time, and something else that he didn't seem to have a way to say yet. "You should go back out there," she said. "People will notice if you're gone too long." "In a minute," he said. He stayed where he was. "Evelyn." "Yes, but I want to say something, and I'm not good at saying things." "I know," she said. "Try anyway." He looked at the kitchen table for a moment. Then he looked at her. "When you got off that train, I thought I was getting a practical arrangement, someone to help manage things. I thought that was all I was capable of wanting anymore." She waited. "I was wrong about that," he said. "It came out rough, the way true things do when they've been inside someone for a while. About several things. About what you were. About what I needed." He stopped. "About what's been missing from this place for a long time. The kitchen fire had been burning all day, and the room was warm, and the gathering outside was still going on, and she could hear it. That particular sound of many people choosing to stay somewhere because they don't want to leave. And Evelyn Rowan Granger stood in her kitchen and looked at this man who had written the plainest letter she'd ever received and sent her a train ticket without a note, and who turned out to be, under all the stone and silence, someone she had not expected. "You're not bad at saying things," she said, "when they matter." He looked at her for another moment. Then he crossed the kitchen, and he did something he had not done in the weeks since she'd arrived. He reached out and took her hand, both of his wrapped around one of hers, and just stood there for a moment, not saying anything else. She didn't say anything either. Sometimes the words have all been used up, and what's left is just the fact of a person standing close to you in a warm room, and that fact is enough. Harlan Blackridge left the gathering at 4:00. He shook hands on his way out, complimented Evelyn on the food with the specific graciousness of a man who believes complimenting a woman's cooking is a form of harmless charity, and drove his wagon south without looking back. He didn't know. She was certain of that. He had spent the afternoon in a yard full of people who were, as far as he could tell, eating food and exchanging neighborly pleasantries, and he had read nothing in any face that told him otherwise, and he drove home satisfied that the gathering had been exactly what it appeared. A plain woman's attempt to build community, pleasant and ultimately irrelevant. He was still wrong about her, right up until he couldn't be anymore. The weeks that followed were not simple, and Evelyn didn't pretend they were going to be. Deaver opened the formal investigation from Helena. Gerald Poe, once the process became official, submitted his full testimony. 12 pages of careful, precise documentation of everything he had observed and everything he had been pressured to overlook over the past 2 years. It was the testimony of a man who had been waiting for permission to tell the truth, and once he had it, he was thorough. The bank management and Billings responded to the federal inquiry the way Evelyn had predicted, with rapid, cooperative flexibility that was entirely self-interested and entirely useful. The fraudulent loan notice was voided. The accelerated repayment demand was formally withdrawn. The original loan terms were renegotiated at a rate more favorable than the original, which was the bank's quiet way of expressing how much it wanted this matter to conclude without a public proceeding. Silas signed the new agreement on a Tuesday morning in Millhaven and came home and put the paperwork on the kitchen table and stood there looking at it. "It's done?" Evelyn said. "That part's done," he said. She put coffee in front of him and sat down across from him, and they read through the documents together, the same way they'd read through ledgers and bank notices and land dispute filings over the past weeks. Side by side, practically, the way two people handle the business of a life they're building together. The land dispute was resolved faster than Deaver had expected. Patterson's formal documentation of the survey discrepancy, combined with Claire's testimony about the originals in her father's files, was sufficient for the Territorial Land Commission to invalidate the fraudulent claim within 6 weeks. The Northern 40 remained Granger land, as it had been for 30 years, as it would remain. Harlan Blackridge's response to the investigation was, in the end, less dramatic than his schemes had been. He hired lawyers. He denied things. He cooperated minimally and strategically. But the evidence Poe had provided and Claire had copied and Patterson had verified was not the kind that could be explained away by a man in a good coat with a pleasant smile, and the federal marshal's office was not the kind of institution that found pleasant smiles particularly relevant. He did not go to prison. The legal proceedings stretched and settled and eventually resolved in a way that was unsatisfying if you wanted clean justice and sufficient if you wanted practical outcome. Fines, the forced relinquishment of land acquired through fraudulent means, the removal of the bank officials who had participated, and a public record that attached his name to what he had done in language that was too specific to be misunderstood. He left the territory within the year. Quietly, without announcement, the way men leave places where they've lost. His operation was bought by a consortium of the smaller ranchers he'd spent years trying to absorb, at a price that was fair because nobody was desperate anymore. Claire Blackridge did not go with him. She came to the ranch in April, 6 weeks after the gathering, on a cold, clear day when the snow was finally starting to mean it about leaving. She came alone, with a traveling bag, and knocked on the front door, which nobody at Granger Ranch ever did. They all came around back to the kitchen, the way people did when they felt they belonged somewhere. Evelyn opened the door. Claire looked like someone who had been through several kinds of weather recently and was still figuring out what season she'd come out into. "I left," she said simply. "I'm not going with him." "I know," Evelyn said. "Come in." "I don't know what I'm doing," Claire said, standing in the entry hall with her bag and her honesty. "I don't have a plan. I have some money of my own. My mother's money. He never touched that. But I don't have—" She stopped. "I don't really have anywhere." "You have here," Evelyn said. "For as long as you need." Claire looked at her. "You don't owe me anything. What I did because it was right, not for a reward." "I know that too," Evelyn said. "That's exactly why I'm saying it." Claire stayed 3 months at Granger Ranch. She was, it turned out, meticulous with numbers. She had managed her father's household accounts since she was 16, and the experience had given her a precision that was genuinely useful. Evelyn put her to work on the ranch books without making a formal thing of it, just in the way that work found people at Granger Ranch, because there was work to be done, and Claire was there, and capable of doing it. By the time she left, she had a position lined up at a merchant house in Helena that did land and supply contracts, arranged through Patterson, who had a long memory for competent people. She left with a reference letter that Evelyn wrote herself and that said, among other things, that Claire Blackridge had more moral courage than most people twice her age, which was true, and which Evelyn thought the merchant house in Helena ought to know. Rufus, the oldest hand, the one who had looked at Evelyn on her first night like she was a problem that hadn't declared itself. Rufus asked Silas in the late spring, when they were fixing fence on the east side, whether Mrs. Granger was planning to stay. Silas looked at him. "She lives here, Rufus." "I know that," Rufus said, with the mild irritation of someone who asked a precise question and got an imprecise answer. "I mean, is she staying? Permanent? The way this place needs?" Silas went back to the fence post he was setting. "Yeah," he said, "she's staying." Rufus picked up his end of the wire. "Good," he said, and didn't say anything else about it, which was as close to a formal endorsement as Rufus had given anything in 20 years of working cattle. Pete's hand healed correctly. He stayed on at Granger Ranch and eventually became the man who trained new hands, which suited him. He had the temperament for it, patient and direct, and he told every new man on his first day that if something was broken or wrong or hurting, you said so, because this was not a place where you suffered alone and called it strength. He'd learned that from someone. He never explained who, but everyone knew. That summer, the ranch ran better than it had in a decade. Not because everything went right. Fences broke, cattle got through to the wrong pasture. A dry stretch in August made the water situation in the North Fields genuinely difficult. The cattle market didn't recover completely, and they had a hard month in September. There were arguments between ranch hands that required managing, a supply order that came in wrong and had to be sent back, a day in October when everything seemed to break at once, and Silas came in for supper looking like a man who had been beaten by circumstances, and dinner was late because the stove had given trouble, and they both sat down to a meal that was 20 minutes behind and slightly overcooked, and neither of them said a word about any of it. That was real life. Not a story about a ranch being saved, just the actual work of a place and a life, with all the ordinary difficulty that entailed. But the hands ate together every night, and the work got done. And when Tom Briggs's wife had a medical crisis in November and Tom couldn't work for 2 weeks, 3 men from Granger Ranch went over without being asked and kept his operation running until he could come back. And he never forgot it, and he made sure other people knew about it, which was how these things spread. The territory noticed. Not all at once, not with any announcement, but the shape of things changed over the following year in the way that shapes change when a center of gravity shifts. Other ranches stopped competing quite so reflexively, started asking each other for help before things became crises, started coming to the Granger Ranch for reasons that had nothing to do with drama or need, just because it had become the kind of place that people wanted to be. None of that was an accident. But one evening in the late fall, almost a year after Evelyn had stepped off a train with a worn suitcase and no certainty of welcome, she and Silas were sitting on the porch after supper in the cold. Not for any particular reason. The work was done. The house was quiet. They just sat there with their coffee in the cold the way people sit when they're somewhere they want to be. Silas said, after a while, "I've been thinking about that letter I sent, to the agency." "The one where you said you weren't looking for romance," she said. "That one." He looked out at the dark property. "I think I wrote that because I'd forgotten it was something a person could have, not because I actually didn't want it." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "I figured that out in the first week." He looked at her sideways. "And you stayed anyway." "I came here to help build something," she said. "I didn't know what it was going to be exactly, but yes, I stayed anyway." He looked back out at the dark. "Evelyn, what did you actually think getting off that train? Honestly, what did you think when you saw me standing there?" She considered it, the honest answer, not the comfortable one. "I thought you looked like a man who had been holding everything alone for so long that you'd stopped believing anything else was possible," she said. "And I thought, that's fixable, if someone just shows up and stays." He was quiet for a long time. "Showing up and staying doesn't sound like much," he said finally. "It's everything," she said. "It's almost always everything." The wind came through the fencing with its usual business. The cattle were settled for the night. Somewhere in the bunkhouse, a lamp was still burning, someone still awake. And the small fact of that light visible from the porch was its own kind of comfort. The confirmation that there were people here, real people, with their histories and their difficulties and their loyalty, and they were all, in their imperfect and various ways, home. Silas reached over and took her hand. She let him keep it. Neither of them said anything else for a while, and that was fine. They had time. They had the cold dark and the coffee going lukewarm and the whole difficult ordinary future ahead of them, and they had each other, which was something neither of them had believed in quite this way until it happened. It wasn't a perfect life. She would have been suspicious of a perfect life. It was a real one, and a real one, she had always known, was worth every mile of the ride to get there.